The stone floor of the nave is cold through the sole of a shoe even in August. The walls hold a specific temperature that has nothing to do with the season outside. In the oldest sections, nave walls 6 and 7 feet thick, limestone blocks set in the 11th and 12th centuries. The interior air maintains a humidity the building produces through the thermal mass of the stone itself. Modern conservation engineers have measured it, roughly 85% relative humidity at approximately 10 degrees Celsius, sustained year-round in the undercroft and side aisles, regardless of the weather outside. That range matches the conditions maintained in modern specialist wards for respiratory recovery and wound care. The church was not designed by thermal engineers. It was built 1,000 years ago, and for most of those 1,000 years, the sick were brought inside. Why does every surviving administrative record from English monastic infirmaries between 700 and 1536 document clinical diagnosis, herbal preparation, and wound treatment as a primary institutional function, while the official framing of that same tradition describes only spiritual care? And why does the legislative sequence that ended this practice, the 1511 Physicians and Surgeons Act, the 1518 Royal College of Physicians Charter, the 1536 Dissolution, survive in complete archival detail, while the therapeutic knowledge those laws displaced is catalogued today as religious writing rather than medicine? 3 evidentiary fields align. The physical conditions of stone church interiors match documented therapeutic environments. The administrative records of monastic infirmaries document clinical practice across 9 centuries. The legislative record of what replaced them documents, in the founder's own language, that it was replacing something real. What does not exist is an official account that connects those 3 fields into the same story. That is the conflict. That is what this video addresses. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. Hildegard of Bingen was a Benedictine abbess who ran the infirmary at Rupertsberg, Germany from 1150 until her death in 1179. She wrote 2 medical texts, the Physica and the Causae et Curae. The Physica documents over 200 plants with specific therapeutic applications, dosages, preparation methods, contraindications, disease indications. It is not a prayer book. It is a pharmacopoeia. The Physica has been held in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin since the 19th century. It is catalogued under theology and natural history. The accepted explanation is straightforward. Medieval churches offered spiritual comfort to the sick, prayer, last rites, the presence of the sacred. Clergy provided charity, not clinical care. What medical knowledge existed was primitive, humoral theory, prayer over herbs, a conflation of the spiritual and the physiological that the church itself never distinguished clearly. Modern medicine, emerging through licensed universities in the 16th and 17th centuries, replaced a system that had always been essentially religious. This is the account given in every standard history of medicine. It is coherent. It is internally consistent. It covers the transition without a gap. The infirmarius was a permanent officer in every major Benedictine and Cistercian house in England by the 11th century. The rule governing the office is specific. He visited the sick ward twice a day, performed urine examination, the primary diagnostic procedure of medieval medicine, requiring identification of color, consistency, and sediment patterns to distinguish fever, kidney disorder, and infection, prepared prescriptions from a dispensary attached to the infirmary, and maintained a physic garden producing the herbs used in those preparations. He kept records. At Westminster Abbey, the infirmarer's accounts survive in the Abbey muniments from the 13th and 14th centuries. They record the purchase of specific medicinal herbs, the quantities dispensed, and expenditure on individual patients by name. These are not records of prayer. They are procurement records for a medical supply chain. But here is where it stops being about charity. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris was founded in 651 AD and attached directly to Notre Dame Cathedral. It is the oldest hospital in continuous operation anywhere in the world today. For the first 9 centuries of its existence, it was staffed entirely by Augustinian nuns. The rule governing their care is documented. Patients were assessed on arrival, assigned beds according to condition severity, fed twice daily, their wounds cleaned and dressed with specific preparations recorded in the house records, stone-walled wards, stable temperature, and humidity maintained by the cathedral's thermal mass year-round, care structured to a daily clinical schedule. The Augustinian rule at the Hôtel-Dieu was not incidental to the cathedral. The cathedral wall was the infirmary wall. The building still stands. The records of its early operation survive in the Archives Nationales in Paris. The Catholic Encyclopedia entry for the Hôtel-Dieu runs to several pages. The word clinical does not appear in it once. The stone nave of Winchester Cathedral, built on a foundation of chalk and flint in the late 11th century, maintains an internal humidity of 80 to 90% across the undercroft and side aisles year-round. Modern surveys report the same range at Salisbury, at the undercroft of Canterbury Cathedral, at the nave floor of Ely. This is not a feature that produces comfort. It is a feature that produces specific physiological conditions. Modern respiratory physicians specify 60 to 80% relative humidity as the optimal range for airway recovery and wound healing. Medieval builders did not have respiratory physicians. They had 9 centuries of evidence that sick people brought into these spaces recovered at rates the surrounding environment did not explain. What that environment felt like from inside. Stone walls that never fully warm in summer and never fully chill in winter. Air that carries no dust from thatch or earthen floors. A stillness that is not silence. The patient lying in the side aisle of a 12th century nave was inside a structure whose thermal mass regulated temperature more precisely than any medieval building technology could produce in timber, wattle, or fired brick. The stone itself was the therapy. No one wrote that down. They built the stone. They brought the sick inside. The records document both. The connection between them is not in the records. Now look at this carefully, because the next document is the part most historians walk past. The Physica is not the only surviving text of church-based clinical practice. Gilbertus Anglicus, an English physician who trained and practiced within the church's institutional network in the early 13th century, wrote the Compendium Medicine around 1240. It is the first comprehensive medical encyclopedia written by an English practitioner. It documents treatments for scabies, smallpox, leprosy, eye conditions, and fever in clinical detail. Specific herbs, specific preparations, specific dosage schedules for specific presentations. His section on skin disease describes stages of infection and progression that modern dermatologists recognize as accurate clinical observation. His section on fever identifies categories: continuous, or intermittent, quotidian, that map onto bacterial and malarial infection in ways that are not accidental. Gilbertus was a layman, but his training, his institutional base, and his patient population were all ecclesiastical. The compendium is referenced in histories of medicine as a curiosity, a transitional text, a bridge between the theological and the scientific. The bridge was a hospital. The hospital was in a church. Here is the part which will change how you look at every church you've walked past. The monastic infirmary at Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk treated townspeople as well as monks from at least the 12th century. The infirmary maintained a physic garden cultivating over 40 medicinal species. The 14th century accounts record the purchase of medicinal imports, ginger, cinnamon, galingale, alongside domestic herbs from the garden. These are not liturgical items. They are entries in a medical supply ledger. The infirmary at Bury served the surrounding community for 4 centuries before the dissolution. The infirmarer's accounts were confiscated with all other monastic property in 1539. The building was demolished. The physic garden was cleared. No inventory was made of what was known inside that garden before the clearance. The accounts are in the Public Record Office at Kew, catalogued as administrative documents of a dissolved religious house. 3 separate bodies of evidence: the clinical records of monastic infirmaries, the documented physical conditions of stone church interiors, and the medical text produced by church-trained practitioners, all describe the same institution. A functional healthcare system, staffed, supplied, physically calibrated, and producing documented outcomes across 9 centuries and hundreds of sites. The official narrative of this period describes spiritual comfort and primitive medicine. The records describe a clinical operation. The infirmarer at Westminster was buying ginger and galingale in the 1340s. That is not a record of prayer. Those 2 accounts cannot both be complete. Here is the part which should genuinely stop you. In 1511, Henry VIII's Parliament passed the Physicians and Surgeons Act. The act required anyone practicing medicine or surgery to hold a license issued by the Bishop of London or the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, supported by qualified medical testimony. The explicit rationale stated in the preamble was that medicine was being practiced by a great multitude of ignorant persons who lacked formal qualification. The Church was designated as the licensing authority. The same institution that had housed the healing tradition for 9 centuries was now being used to regulate it out of existence. Bishops would certify who could practice. University-educated practitioners would define what counted as qualification. What the infirmarius had done for 3 centuries would now require a degree from Oxford or Cambridge to perform legally. The preamble of the 1511 Act specifically named women among those ignorant persons who were illegally practicing medicine. This is the first appearance of women in English medical legislation. The female healers the Act was targeting were not untrained empirics. They were the nuns who ran the infirmary wards at every major Benedictine and Cistercian house in England. Their training had been institutional, continuous, and generations deep. The Act did not distinguish between an Augustinian infirmarer with 40 years of clinical experience and a market-town charlatan selling remedies at a fair. Both were unlicensed. Both were therefore illegal after 1511. If you've made it this far, you now know more than 99% of people. But what follows is where the record becomes most specific. In 1518, Thomas Linacre petitioned Henry VIII for a royal charter establishing the College of Physicians of London. The charter was granted on September 23, 1518. Thomas Linacre was a scholar, a humanist, and an ordained Catholic priest. The college he founded required candidates to hold a degree from Oxford or Cambridge and to be examined in Latin. The founding rationale, recorded in the petition, described medicine as having been engrossed by illiterate monks and empirics. That language is in the document. Linacre was describing the people his institution was designed to replace. He was an ordained priest who spent his career inside church institutions. He replaced the monks with university-educated physicians. The tradition he was replacing was the one he had grown up inside. That is the institution that issued the replacement's founding charter. Here is what should genuinely trouble you about that licensing record. The 1511 Act and the 1518 Charter were followed, within 18 years, by the complete closure of the institutions those monks had operated. Between 1536 and 1540, Henry VIII dissolved over 800 religious houses. Among them was every monastic infirmary in England. The administrative records of the dissolution survive in the National Archives at Kew. The Dissolution Commissioners inventoried each house. They listed altar plate, library books, livestock, timber, and lead. They inventoried herbs from physic gardens as garden produce and assigned a monetary value. They did not inventory treatment records as medical knowledge. They did not record clinical methods or therapeutic practices as institutional assets worth preserving. The medical knowledge inside those buildings was not suppressed. It was abandoned without a category. A physic garden was listed as a garden. A dispensary was listed as a store. The healthcare system was invisible to the commissioners because it had no line in their accounting framework. And here is what should trouble you about what came next. The years following the dissolution produced a documented welfare crisis. Thomas Cromwell had proposed redirecting monastic wealth to hospitals, education, and poor relief. It was not. The sick poor who had been treated by monastic infirmaries had no replacement institution. Contemporary accounts describe a measurable increase in begging and destitution across English towns in the decade after 1540. What followed entered the legislative record as a social emergency, severe enough to require parliamentary action. The Poor Law reforms of the late 16th century. The refoundation of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in 1546 and St. Thomas's Hospital in 1551 in London, both specifically established to address the gap the dissolution had created. Both refoundations cited the loss of monastic healthcare as the reason for their establishment. The gap is in the refoundation documents. The thing closed to create it was described in those same years as primitive and religious rather than medical. Both descriptions are in the same archive. Stay with me here, because this last piece is the one that doesn't resolve. The therapeutic knowledge of the monastic tradition did not survive as medicine. Hildegard's Physica survived as spiritual writing. The Compendium Medicine of Gilbertus Anglicus survived as a historical curiosity. The Westminster Infirmarer's accounts survived as administrative documents. None of these sources exist today in a medical archive. They are held in theological collections, natural history departments, and manuscript repositories. The reclassification was not a single decision taken at a single moment. It was the accumulated result of a system: university credentialing, royal licensing, institutional dissolution, that had no category for knowledge produced outside of Latin-educated, degree-holding, university-examined practitioners. The knowledge did not disappear. It was placed in a category where it could not be found by anyone looking for medicine. A researcher looking for the history of English medicine today begins with Thomas Linacre and the 1518 Charter. A researcher looking for what came before finds it catalogued under religion. The archive is complete. The framing determines what the archive contains. This is not an argument that medieval monks were practicing modern clinical medicine while calling it prayer. What the evidence shows is narrower than that and harder to dismiss. Church-based institutions in England operated documented healthcare functions for 9 centuries. Those institutions were closed by specific legislation between 1511 and 1540. The knowledge they held was simultaneously reclassified out of the medical category. The record of what was closed survives. The record of what those institutions therapeutically were does not exist in the form that would make it recoverable. Hildegard of Bingen's Physica is 870 years old. It documents the use of fennel for digestive complaints, lavender for skin conditions, and then comfrey root for wound closure, all 3 of which have confirmed pharmacological mechanisms. She ran an infirmary. She grew the herbs. She treated the sick. The building at Rupertsberg was dissolved in 1632. The infirmary is gone. The physic garden is gone. The text survived because it had value as a religious document. The infirmary did not survive because once the licensing legislation and the dissolution had separated the healing from the church, there was no institutional category left to protect it. The commission inventories are at Kew. The 1511 Act is at Westminster. The 1518 Charter is at the Royal College. Hildegard's Physica is in Berlin under theology. What it is a record of is not what it is catalogued as.